For generations, Lake Powell stood as one of the American Southwest's most striking engineered landscapes, a vast inland sea stretching across the desert, feeding communities, powering cities and drawing millions to its red rock shores. Its sheer size created an illusion of permanence. The marinas, beaches and towering canyon walls seemed to suggest that the water would always be there, held in place behind Glen Canyon Dam, as dependable as the sandstone cliffs surrounding it. But along the shores near Lone Rock, that illusion is disappearing. The signs are impossible to ignore. Areas that once sat beneath deep blue water now lie exposed beneath the desert sun. Boat ramps end far from the shoreline. Mudflats stretch into the distance, where waves once moved against canyon walls. Lone Rock itself, once an island rising from the reservoir, now stands isolated amid broad expanses of dry lakebed. The transformation is so dramatic that visitors who have not seen the area in recent years would hardly recognize it, and the questions are becoming harder to avoid. How did one of the nation's largest reservoirs retreat this far? Why are vast sections of Lake Powell now dry land? And if the shoreline around Lone Rock has changed this quickly, what does that suggest about the future of the reservoir itself? These questions are no longer theoretical. The changing conditions at Lake Powell have become one of the clearest visual warnings of the broader water crisis gripping the Colorado River basin. At Lone Rock, the consequences are visible in stone, mud, and the widening distance between the shore and the water's edge. What was once hidden beneath the surface is now being uncovered, revealing not only the former floor of the reservoir, but also the scale of the crisis deepening across the region. Lake Powell was created in the 1960s with the completion of Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River. The reservoir was designed to store enormous volumes of water, regulate downstream flow, and generate hydroelectric power for millions of people in the western United States. At full pool, Lake Powell can hold roughly 24 million acre-feet, or about 29 billion cubic meters, of water. Its shoreline extends nearly 2,000 miles, or over 3,200 kilometers, weaving through canyons and sandstone formations across Utah and Arizona. For decades, that capacity gave the impression of abundance. The lake filled, marinas expanded, tourism flourished, and the reservoir became an economic and infrastructural anchor for the region. But Lake Powell's stability depended entirely on the Colorado River system, and that system has been under increasing strain for years. Reduced snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, persistent drought, rising temperatures and heavy water demand across the basin have all contributed to declining inflows. Each year, the reservoir depends on runoff from melting mountain snow. In stronger years, the inflow replenishes large portions of the water released downstream. In weak years, the reservoir drops. In recent years, weak runoff has become increasingly common. That decline is now visible in the reservoir's overall storage. Lake Powell currently holds only a fraction of its designed capacity. Water levels remain roughly 170 feet, or about 52 meters, below full pool. The lake that once appeared nearly limitless is now operating with only about 1/4 of its total storage volume. Numbers like these can seem abstract on paper. Percentages and elevation readings do not always capture the physical reality of a shrinking reservoir. But at Lone Rock, those numbers take visible form. Lone Rock is one of Lake Powell's most recognizable landmarks, a massive sandstone formation that rises near the shoreline in the Wahweap Bay area. Under higher water conditions, it appears as an island, surrounded by water and accessible mainly by boat. Families camp on nearby beaches, boats circle its base, and the landmark sits as a centerpiece of one of the reservoir's most popular recreation areas. But under current conditions, Lone Rock no longer rises from water. Instead, it towers above a dry and expanding basin of exposed sediment, sand, and vegetation. The shoreline has retreated so far that visitors can walk long distances across terrain that was underwater only a few years ago. The exposed landscape surrounding Lone Rock reveals the scale of Lake Powell's decline more vividly than any water-level chart could. Dead tamarisk trees stand in clusters across the former lake bed, remnants of vegetation that once lined earlier shorelines before being inundated. Now, as the water recedes, their skeletal remains emerge again from the drying sediment. Tumbleweeds roll across open stretches where boats once floated. The dry ground itself tells the history of the retreat. Sediment layers deposited during years of higher water are now exposed in the walls of nearby canyons. Mineral stains form pale rings along the rock faces, marking where the water once stood. These bathtub rings, left by minerals deposited during years of submersion, stretch high above the current shoreline. They create stark white outlines against the red sandstone, a visible measure of how far the reservoir has fallen. Around Lone Rock, the difference between past and present is dramatic. Where water once lapped against the rock formation, broad expanses of land now separate it from the lake. What was once an island has become a monument to retreat. This retreat is not happening because of a single dry season. It is the cumulative effect of years of declining inflow combined with constant outflow obligations. Lake Powell serves as a balancing reservoir within the Colorado River compact system, which requires water releases to downstream states. Even when inflows are low, water must still move downstream to meet legal and operational requirements. That means the reservoir continues losing water even during years when incoming runoff is weak. Federal runoff projections for this year estimate inflows of only about 2.3 million acre-feet, or roughly 2.8 billion cubic meters, just over one-third of average annual inflow. For a reservoir the size of Lake Powell, that shortfall is severe. The effect is compounded by temperature. Warmer winters mean more precipitation falls as rain rather than snow. Snowpack acts as natural storage, releasing water gradually during the spring melt season. Rain runs off more quickly and often less efficiently into the reservoir system. Hotter summers also increase evaporation losses across the reservoir's vast surface area. Lake Powell spans immense desert terrain, and evaporation has always been part of its water balance. But as temperatures rise, evaporation intensifies. Every year, substantial volumes of water are lost directly to the atmosphere. In an already stressed system, these losses further reduce available storage. At Lone Rock, the results are visible not just in the receding shoreline, but in the newly exposed terrain. Side canyons once flooded by the reservoir are reappearing. Narrow passages cut through sandstone walls are accessible again. Sediment deposited during years underwater has begun to dry and crack, revealing layers that trace the lake's fluctuating levels over decades. These exposed canyons are reshaping the geography of the shoreline. Places that were once open water are becoming land corridors. Former bays are narrowing into channels. Sandbars and mudflats expand as the lake pulls back. The process creates an unstable landscape. Some areas of exposed lakebed harden into walkable terrain, while others remain saturated beneath the surface. Mudflats can appear solid but behave like quicksand under pressure, trapping vehicles and making travel hazardous. Recreation areas that once welcomed vehicles and campers are becoming increasingly unpredictable as the sediment shifts between wet and dry conditions. The environmental changes extend beyond access hazards. As the reservoir retreats, ecosystems built around stable waterlines are disrupted. Shoreline vegetation dies back or relocates. Aquatic habitats shrink. Wildlife patterns shift as water sources move farther from established feeding areas. Even the reservoir's infrastructure feels the pressure. Boat ramps designed for higher water levels become unusable as the shoreline retreats beyond their reach. Marinas must be relocated or extended. Recreation services face rising operational costs just to maintain access. Areas that once supported dense visitor activity are left stranded above the new shoreline. The economic consequences spread through nearby communities. Lake Powell has long been a major tourism driver for towns in northern Arizona and southern Utah. Boating, fishing, camping and marina operations generate millions in local revenue. But when the lake shrinks, that economic engine weakens. At Lone Rock, beach camping areas once prized for immediate water access now sit far from the shoreline. Launch conditions become more difficult. Visitor experiences change. Lower water levels reduce the appeal of areas that built their identity around the reservoir's presence. Yet the most concerning issue extends beyond recreation and tourism. Lake Powell is not just a destination, it is a crucial water storage and energy facility. The reservoir supports hydroelectric generation at Glen Canyon Dam. That power supplies electricity across multiple western states. Hydropower depends on sufficient water elevation to drive the turbines efficiently. As lake levels drop, generating capacity declines. Lake Powell is now approaching levels where power production becomes increasingly constrained. If the reservoir falls to around 3,490 feet, or roughly 1,064 meters above sea level, the dam nears the threshold where hydropower generation may no longer function reliably. That threshold is alarmingly close compared with the reservoir's historical operating range. Every additional drop narrows the margin. As Lake Powell continues to recede, the exposed terrain around Lone Rock is revealing more than dry sediment and stranded shoreline. It is exposing the hidden mechanics of a reservoir in decline. What appears at first to be a simple drop in water level is in reality a chain reaction affecting geology, infrastructure, ecosystems, recreation, and the long-term viability of one of the Southwest's most critical water storage systems. The newly uncovered canyons and lake bed near Lone Rock offer a striking picture of how dramatically the reservoir has changed. Areas that remained underwater for decades are now dry enough to walk through. Long submerged sandstone walls bear mineral stains that mark former water elevations. Layers of soft sediment, once resting beneath deep water, are drying in the desert heat and breaking apart. These changes are not merely cosmetic. They demonstrate how far the lake has fallen and how much of its former footprint is no longer functioning as active reservoir space. This loss of active storage matters because Lake Powell was designed to act as a buffer in the Colorado River system. During wet years, it stores runoff from snowmelt in the upper basin states. During dry periods, it releases that water downstream, helping maintain water deliveries across the Southwest. The reservoir's usefulness depends not simply on whether water remains in the basin, but on how much of that water is stored at elevations where it can still be managed effectively. As the lake drops, the system becomes less flexible. Storage capacity shrinks, hydropower efficiency declines, and the margin for handling dry years becomes dangerously thin. Water managers have fewer options, and each poor runoff season carries greater consequences than the one before. The exposed canyon floor around Lone Rock illustrates that shrinking flexibility in visible terms. Former bays are now dry corridors. Water that once filled wide inlets has retreated into narrower channels farther from shore. The changing shape of the reservoir means less surface area is covered by usable water in areas that once served recreational and operational functions. At the same time, the lake's retreat is altering the physical condition of the newly exposed land. Decades of sediment deposition created soft layers of mud, silt and sand along the former lake bottom. Once exposed, these sediments do not immediately become stable ground. In many places, they remain saturated below the surface, creating dangerous conditions for vehicles and foot traffic. Sections that appear dry may collapse under weight, trapping tires or sinking under pressure. These unstable surfaces complicate access around Lone Rock and throughout Lake Powell's receding shoreline. Roads and launch areas designed for predictable water elevations become increasingly difficult to maintain. Recreation managers face constant adjustments as the shoreline moves and exposed land remains hazardous. Temporary closures, rerouted access points, and changing launch conditions become part of the seasonal routine. For the local tourism economy, these disruptions create mounting challenges. Lake Powell attracts visitors from across the country for boating, fishing and camping, and much of that activity depends on easy access to the water. When the lake retreats hundreds of feet from former shorelines, the visitor experience changes. Boat launches become harder to use. Campsites lose their shoreline appeal. Marina operations require costly modifications to remain functional. Near Lone Rock, where beach camping has long been a major attraction, the growing distance between campsites and water changes the practical value of the location. Areas that once offered direct lake access now sit separated from the water by wide stretches of exposed sediment. This affects not only recreation, but also the businesses that rely on steady visitor demand. The economic strain mirrors the environmental strain. As the reservoir contracts, the surrounding ecosystems must adapt to rapidly changing shoreline conditions. Aquatic habitats shrink as shallow water areas disappear. Fish spawning grounds are altered. Shoreline vegetation, already stressed by arid conditions, is displaced again as water retreats farther from established growth zones. The emergence of dead vegetation around Lone Rock highlights this ecological disruption. Plants that once occupied the shoreline were submerged when the reservoir filled. Now, as the water recedes, those remnants are being uncovered in dry, lifeless stands. In some places, new vegetation is beginning to colonize the exposed lakebed, but this process is uneven and slow. The environment left behind by a receding reservoir is not immediately suitable for stable ecological recovery. The newly exposed land is often salty, unstable, and vulnerable to erosion. Wind moves loose sediment across open stretches of lakebed. Rain cuts channels through freshly exposed surfaces. Without established vegetation, the land remains highly dynamic, changing season by season. This transformation creates another long-term concern: sediment redistribution. Rivers and tributaries feeding Lake Powell carry sediment that settles in the reservoir. During years of higher water, much of that material remains submerged. As lake levels fall, those deposits become exposed and vulnerable to wind and erosion. Sediment that was once trapped underwater can be mobilized again, altering shorelines and affecting water quality in remaining channels. Around Lone Rock, sediment layers exposed inside canyons reveal how much material has accumulated during the reservoir's life. Some deposits form steep walls, several feet thick, evidence of decades of gradual build-up. As the reservoir shrinks, these sediment accumulations reshape the basin's contours, changing how water occupies the remaining space. This matters because storage capacity is not determined only by water level. Sediment takes up physical volume within the reservoir. Over time, the amount of water the basin can store declines as sediment fills sections of the lake. When water levels are already low, that lost capacity becomes even more significant. The cumulative effect of drought, evaporation, low runoff and sedimentation is pushing Lake Powell closer to critical operational thresholds. Among the most serious is the risk to hydroelectric generation at Glen Canyon Dam. Hydropower depends on the vertical distance between the water surface and the turbines. As lake elevation drops, the pressure driving the turbines decreases. This reduces generating efficiency and eventually threatens the ability to produce electricity at all. If water levels fall below the minimum power pool threshold, the dam may no longer generate hydropower reliably. That threshold represents far more than an engineering benchmark. Glen Canyon Dam supplies electricity to millions of users and supports power systems across the region. Reduced hydropower output increases pressure on other energy sources and raises operational costs. A continued decline at Lake Powell could therefore affect not just water storage, but also regional energy stability. The exposed conditions at Lone Rock are part of that warning. The retreating shoreline is the visible edge of a reservoir losing operational resilience. Every additional foot of decline reduces the margin for managing water deliveries, sustaining power generation, and maintaining the system's role in the Colorado River Basin. If you found this video valuable, make sure to like, share and subscribe and tap that hype icon to help this video reach a wider audience. Your support helps bring more in-depth coverage on the environmental changes reshaping critical regions across the world.